I wonder, when you saw that the evening plenary was on the subject of science, maybe some of you, it warmed your heart. It was like, yes, this is my evening. I love science. Maybe you studied a scientific degree, even if you're not necessarily in that area now. But maybe some of you are. I know there's a scientist network, so some of you here are very much in the sciences. So that will be some of us. And then there'll be others of us that will be all too aware of the importance of being able to respond to the science God question. It just keeps coming up. But one thing that we all have in common, perhaps, is that we have all benefited from science and medicine and technology. These things have given us the internet. They have sequenced every gene in the human body. They've enabled us to see to the boundaries of the known universe. They've developed medicines and treatments that improve and lengthen human life. Science, we have much to be thankful for in many ways. My story is that I grew up in a kind of religiously neutral home. I didn't really know what I believed about God, but what I did know was that I wanted to be a scientist. And as soon as I could, I specialized. I did biology, chemistry, maths at A-level, which is high school, and I arrived at university at the age of 18 to study biochemistry. In my very first week, I was invited to an event called Guerrilla Christian. Now, that's nothing to do with barbecuing, but it was actually, although we may go back to those days, they did used to barbecue Christians. Anyway, 4 Christians in a row, we could ask anything that we wanted. So I sat there and I listened to everyone else's questions. And about halfway through the evening, I plucked up courage to ask my own question. Surely you can't believe in God and be a scientist at the same time. And I was given an answer that actually changed the whole landscape for me, that set me grilling a lot more Christians, asking a lot more questions. But my initial question assumed conflict. It was something that I somehow had absorbed and arrived at university with. And this is the starting assumption for many people. In a 2015 Pew Forum survey of religiously unaffiliated adults in the USA, 59% said that science and religion are often in conflict, compared to 38% saying that they are compatible. And we could look at a survey between Theos and the Faraday Institute in the UK in 2022. They interviewed over 100 leading scientists and did a YouGov opinion poll of 5,000 UK adults, and that showed 57% believing they were incompatible, compared to 30% believing that they weren't. And there will be similar trends across Europe as well. And this has often really not helped. This whole idea of there being conflict has not helped because some very influential scientists are atheists. We could look at any number of people. For example, the late Stephen Hawking, in an interview in 2014, said, "Before we understood science, it was natural to believe that God created the universe. But now, science offers a more convincing explanation." In other words, he was saying that spiritual explanations filled a gap for a while, but now the sciences have saved the day. Now, this view of conflict is especially ironic because the ground, the soil in which modern science grew and developed was within a Christian worldview. It arose from within 17th century Europe, where the Christian worldview had saturated intellectual life and had captured the imagination of scholars. And so how is it that we now are dealing with questions of conflict? Well, in this plenary, I want to look at a number of different things. Why was it that Christian belief gave rise to scientific study? What is the current climate? What are some key areas of debate? And what does it mean in practice to be a Christian in the scientific world. So firstly, why did Christian belief in particular give rise to scientific study? Why didn't other belief systems give rise to the scientific method, to experimentation? Let's look at polytheism, the belief that there are many personal but finite gods, like the Greek, Norse, and Roman gods. Why didn't polytheism give rise to science? Well, because under polytheism, the universe is not governed by one transcendent, rational being, but by many chaotic, finite beings, each presiding over a particular part of the natural world. There may be laws of nature, but they operate at the whim of the gods, and therefore they are unpredictable, and therefore why study them? What about pantheism, which is belief in an impersonal but infinite deity, which forms the basis of some forms of Eastern thought? Why didn't this give rise to the sciences? Well, because at the heart of pantheism is not a personal being. It's better described as a force or essence. You'll know this if there are any Star Wars fans out there. Star Wars is very much based on a pantheistic way of looking at the world. But forces on their own don't create things. They just are. And furthermore, the goal of a pantheist is to transcend the physical world into a state that is beyond the laws of nature. Pantheism has led to meditation rather than experimentation. What about Greek philosophy? Even though this has had a huge impact on Western culture, it wasn't enough to produce experimental sciences. Why not? One reason is Gnosticism, which says that the physical world is secondary to the spiritual world, perhaps even evil, and therefore should not be studied. Another reason is deduction. Ancient Greeks assumed that we could just figure out the way the world was by reason alone. They would make deductions. For example, take a chair. Once you've deduced that the purpose of a chair is for someone to sit on it, then you can say, well, it's got 4 legs because it needs to be stable, and it's made of metal and material because it needs to be comfortable. And they would make all kinds of deductions about the way the world was. And so Greek philosophy gave us brilliant things like mathematics and logic, but not experimental science. Perhaps one of the most well-known examples of how experimentation changed our view of the world was in the shift from Aristotle's geocentric view that the sun orbited the earth, which had held sway for over 1,000 years, to Copernicus and Galileo's heliocentric view that the earth and other planets orbited the sun, which they deduced and discovered through observation. We have the experimental sciences to thank for the realization that we are not the center of the universe. Now, Christian monotheism, Christian belief, stands in stark contrast to all other beliefs, because it believes that the universe has been purposefully brought into being by a single divine being who is outside of time and space. The natural world is not evil or secondary. That's why it's declared good over and over again in Genesis 1, which is a note to the Gnostics. It is not divine or chaotic, but is predictable and orderly because there's a single being that presides over all of it, which is a note to the polytheists. And it is not impersonal and static, but purposefully brought into being, which is a note to the pantheists. And to the Greek philosophers, in the words of scholar Nancy Pearcey, we cannot simply deduce what God must have done. Instead, we have to observe and experiment to discover what, in fact, God did. And so under Christian monotheism, modern science flourished. Perhaps an example of one such scientist who created and made a significant contribution to scientific discovery is James Clerk Maxwell, the first Cavendish Professor of Physics at the University of Cambridge. Clerk Maxwell had Psalm 111 verse 2 inscribed above the entrance to the door of the physics department. And what does that say? It says, "Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." Clerk Maxwell saw his science as a means of firstly delighting in and pondering and discovering the works of God. And so science came to thrive under Christian monotheism. So take encouragement from that this evening. But what is the current climate? Well, there are, of course, still today many scientists who are Christians. We could name any number of people. For example, Francis Collins, former director of NIH, former director of the Human Genome Project, responsible for the COVID-19 vaccine rollout in the USA. He said, "God is most certainly not threatened by science. He made it possible." But of course, as we've already seen through the surveys and through stories like my own, there is the perception of conflict. Christian belief and science are perceived to be in conflict. And we're also in a situation where the presumed backdrop, the neutral position, is that matter is all that there is. And that is the presumed backdrop in the sciences. Material explanations are all that we need because matter is all that there is. Now, how did we get here from such glorious beginnings? Well, that's a whole talk in and of itself. But in summary, some discoveries were seen as conflicting with scientific belief, such as Darwin's theory of evolution compared with Genesis 1. There was also a political situation in the 19th century where some scientists wanted to distance themselves from the church because they wanted to professionalize science, and this led to the bandying around of terms like warfare and conflict, and that carry through to the present day. And of course, some scientific discoveries have rightly overturned wrong spiritual thinking. For example, the idea that events in nature are the actions of the gods. Take a volcanic eruption in the ancient world. A volcanic eruption would have been thought to be the Roman god Vulcan venting his anger. But of course, now geophysics tells us about pyroclastic flow and vents and pressure changes and ash. And so some spiritual explanations have been overturned by scientific ones. And that has led to the perception that just because some spiritual explanations are irrelevant, that all spiritual explanations are irrelevant. But that is not the case. And the whole landscape, as I've thought more and more about it, is really littered with faulty dilemmas. Have you noticed? It's as though we're made to seem like we need to choose between just two options, when in reality there are more options available. When we ask the question, has science displaced God? We're asking someone to choose between a scientific mechanism or a spiritual mechanism. When we ask the question, is faith irrational? We're saying, do you need to choose between being a thinking person or a person of faith? Or on the question of miracles, are they anti-scientific? We're asking someone to choose between a miracle or the laws of nature. And so it seems like we're made to choose, but that is actually not the case. On the question of science and God, the one that I asked at my Guerrilla Christian event in my first week at university, the response I was given was akin to this. Look, is the existence of Jeff Bezos in conflict with the processes and procedures and website that undergird Amazon? Of course not. You think about that for 1 nanosecond and say, you actually need both of those together to have a more complete understanding of Amazon. If you try and take Jeff Bezos out of the picture, you end up with a diminished understanding of Amazon. It is no different with God and science. On faith and irrationality, the truth is everybody has faith in something. Everyone trusts something or someone. And we never exercise that faith in an unthinking way. We always exercise our faith or trust on the basis of the evidence to support it. We trust people in our lives that have a proven track record. We have a low level of trust if we've been let down. But either way, it's always thought through. It's never unthinking. And it's the same with Jesus. When people put their faith in Jesus in first century Palestine, it was not an irrational, blind leap into the dark. It was a response to, here's this living, breathing, thinking, amazing, extraordinary person who treats people like no one else I've ever seen. And people put their faith in him on that basis. And of course, they do that today through all the different ways in which we see God at work in the world and on the basis of the reliability of Scripture as well. And on miracles, well, you need the natural to recognize the supernatural. You need actually the laws and regularities of nature in order to recognize when occasionally something different happens. And if the God of Christianity exists, then he would be able to create laws and regularities that science can measure and that describes what happens 99.99% of the time. And he would be able to occasionally suspend those laws. And not because he's a meddler, but because he's a rescuer. God doesn't intervene in the laws he's created without good reason. And so it seemed like we're made to choose, but we don't need to choose. And this is one of the things to take away. You don't need to choose. We don't need to choose. Our friends don't need to choose. There are more options available. And as Alistair McGrath puts it, in his view of mutual enrichment, the relationship between science and religion, this dialogue offers us a deeper understanding of things than either religion or science could offer unaided. Another encouragement, however, is that the tide is turning. The Theos and Faraday Institute survey that I mentioned to you earlier, its headline is that new atheism is a thing of the past. They say that about 15 years ago, a Comres poll found that 42% of UK adults agreed that faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Today, that figure is 20%. Opinions on science and God are changing, and they are actually changing most rapidly amongst young people, amongst Generation Z or Z, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are from. People born between 1997 and 2012 were in strong disagreement with the statement that you can't be a good scientist and be religious. Isn't that encouraging? Young people actually think differently about this. That's going to shape how we talk about this in all of the different settings that we're in. It's going to shape all kinds of things. And I think that some of these figures, this changing landscape, is due to the faithful work of people like John Lennox, who we've already heard about this evening, Alistair McGrath, the late John Polkinghorne, Francis Collins, and many, many more people. I think it was Ard Louis that described addressing science and God as a bit like when you're gaming and you're kind of knocking down zombies. Now, I'm not a gamer, so I'm kind of speaking not a language that I normally speak. But anyway, apparently, you can like bat down the zombie, but then it gets up and starts walking at you again, and you just have to keep knocking it down. It's the zombie effect. We have to keep batting down the zombies. People keep asking the science and God question. We keep chipping away at it, and eventually you start to see the landscape changes. We're also seeing a move away from strident atheism to much more nuanced atheism. And even Richard Dawkins himself is taking a more nuanced approach than in previous years. I noted a conversation that he had with Francis Collins in 2022 on Premier Unbelievable. And he was quite open and more reflective than he was 3 decades ago. At one point, they were discussing what God might be like if he existed. And Collins said, I think of God as a mind, not as some grey-haired guy in the sky, which has been an unfortunate image foisted on generations of believers. I think of God as a mind that is capable of things that you and I cannot possibly imagine. And Dawkins said, yeah, if he exists, then that must be what he is. Now, that's not an admission of God's existence, but it is a willingness to concede that if God existed, he would be an immaterial mind. That is what he would be. And that is a very different posture to 30 years ago when he was describing faith as one of the world's greatest evils. And so the landscape is still materialistic, but it is changing. Now, what are some key areas of debate? Well, an area that I have thought a lot about and talk about in my book, Am I Just My Brain, is the mind. What is the mind? Is it just matter, as the materialists would have us believe? Are we just our brains? Because some brilliant scientists believe this, such as Francis Crick, known for co-discovering the DNA double helix, who also said, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. I wonder how you feel about that. But the problem is, how can non-conscious neurons generate a conscious mind? The neurons sitting inside your skull are not themselves conscious. So how is it that the sum total of all of that generates conscious you? And this is what's known as the mind-brain problem. Not a new problem, by the way, been discussed since the ancient world. And part of how we go about looking at this is say we don't just have a brain. Yes, we have a brain, thankfully, with all of its neurons and chemicals and electrical activity and hormones, but we also have a mind with its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. There's a you, and you have an inner life, you have a self, and there's a me. And actually, measuring activity from your brain doesn't access that for us. Imagine we wanted to do a study to find out what it's like for you to be at ELF. I managed to find a picture from ELF from last year. Maybe you were here last year. You remember that moment of singing those different languages, a very powerful moment of international unity. You know, and we decided to put an EEG cap on you like the lady in the PowerPoint and measure the electrical signal from your skull 24/7. Imagine we decided to do that. And we decided to pop you in an MRI scanner, be a bit of a queue for that, longer than the queue for the salad bar. And we put you in an MRI scanner, and we take some structural scans and some functional scans. Now that will give us some really interesting data from your brain. But will it tell us what it's like for you to be at ELF? Of course not. For that, we need to ask you what it's like for you to meet old friends and meet new friends and have divine appointments and be in different workshops and hear fantastic teaching and pray together and cry together. We can measure all the data we like from your brain. That can't tell us what it's like to be you. And that is why material processes are not enough to capture the human mind. There is a notion that one day neuroscience eventually will completely solve the problem of human consciousness. But actually, there's quite an interesting scenario that shows us that we're still really far from that. There's a very famous German neuroscientist called Christoph Koch and an Australian philosopher named David Chalmers, and 25 years ago, they made a bet. Koch is a materialist, and he said, eventually, give us long enough, throw enough minds at the problem, we will discover a clear neural pattern underlying human consciousness. And David Chalmers said, nope, he's not a theist, by the way. He's just not a materialist. He said, no neural mechanism will solve conclusively consciousness. So they made a bet, and Koch bet Chalmers a case of wine. And they met last year. And basically, long story short, Chalmers said, it's really clear that things are not clear, are they? So Koch walks off the stage and walks on with a case of wine. Situation solved. Apparently, they've made another bet for another 25 years' time, when I think one of them will be, Koch will be 93 and Chalmers will be 82. Let's see, the jury is still out on that. And of course, the neuroscience will grow and develop, but the question of whether neuroscience will solve this once and for all categorically is not something that can be decided on the basis of the science. That's actually on the basis of philosophy. You see, finding a neural correlate is not the same thing as finding an explanation. And the fact of whether or not we believe science will solve this problem depends on our philosophical view. And there is a difference between the scientific practice of studying the world and scientism, which believes that the sciences can answer life's deepest questions. It's really important for us to know that actually the boundary between science and scientism is actually being crossed all the time. And philosophy leaks into science all the time. I was really struck by the front cover of Scientific American back in 2017 that had this really catchy title, How the Mind Arises. And then this great kind of subtitle underneath that said, Network interactions in the brain create thought. Now tell me, is there a scientific study that we can do that will tell us that network interactions in the brain create thought? No. The best you could get from the sciences is they're connected. Clearly, mind and brain are connected. But just because they are connected doesn't necessarily mean that one has created the other. That's a philosophical statement, masquerading as a scientific statement on the front cover of a scientific journal. And as John Lennox has said several times, statements made by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. It's really important to be aware of when we are crossing the boundary from philosophy to science and back again. And the truth is that a materialistic view undermines the integrity of the very mind that we use as scientists. As John Lennox again said, if I knew my computer was the product of a blind, unguided process, would I trust it? And so why are we prepared to settle for this kind of explanation, this kind of basis for the human mind? And what is the most persuasive, big picture explanation for why, not the neural correlates involved, but why we can even think at all? Why do we have a mind in the first place? Where do the most persuasive explanations come from? Now, if God does not exist, then somehow conscious humans have arisen from within a non-conscious universe. And that's not impossible, and there are, philosophers, scientists out there that will argue that. But it's surprising, right? Is that the best explanation we can give? But if God does exist, and in particular, if the Christian God exists, then we didn't start with matter. We started with a conscious community, the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And that Trinity has always existed, and human beings and the physical world are created by the Trinity. And so if God exists, we didn't start with matter, we started with mind. And as beings that are made in the image of God, we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because he thinks. It's deeply ironic that often we are defending ourselves against the view that Christianity is anti-intellectual. It is, in fact, the very opposite of that. The mind that we have, that we use in the pursuit of science or whatever our field happens to be, makes way more sense if God exists than if he doesn't. There are also very far-reaching implications of the view that you are your brain. I'm going to skim kind of quickly over these. Firstly, there's an erosion of meaning. If our thoughts, words, and actions are just the product of the activity of our brains, then do they in fact come from us? Or do they come from forces beyond our control? This was actually made real to me just after I'd given a talk at a school on mind and brain, and a student put their hand up and said that they didn't believe there was such a thing as free will and that everything was just coming from brain activity. And I said to them, what do I do with your statement then? Is that coming from you, or is it coming from forces beyond your control inside your head? Why are we even bothering having a conversation? What does it mean? So there's an erosion of meaning. Secondly, there are serious implications for moral responsibility. If we're being driven by forces beyond our control, then can we be held morally responsible for anything that we say, think, or do? And of course, we live as though we are the bearer of those actions and thoughts precisely because we reward good behavior and we punish bad on the basis that people have been and can be held morally responsible for their actions. Also, significant implications for what we believe will be possible with AI. If the mind is material, in theory, one day it is able to be replicated artificially. But if there's more to being human than just matter, then not necessarily. And of course, there are implications for what's happening in the brain. There are new areas that have emerged, areas like Neuro Theology, which is the intersection of neuroscience and theology, which asks questions like, what is happening in the brain when we pray? And a lot of scientists are studying this. And they are basically, long story short, things happen in the brain when we pray. Things happen in the brain when we pray. But does that mean that we have then explained away the authenticity of the religious encounter that is happening? Does that mean we have explained away the reality of the relationship? Of course not. Just like we know that your brain activates when you're in love. And just because we've got some brain networks to show what's going on when you're in love, does that mean that the experience of being in love is not real? Does that mean that the relationship isn't genuine? Of course not. The existence of the relationship is why there's brain activity in the first place. It's so interesting that the landscape has shifted. In the ancient world, the physical world was explained in spiritual terms. Natural phenomena were explained in terms of divine action, the action of the gods of nature. But now in the modern world, we're trying to explain the spiritual world purely in physical terms. But those terms are not sufficient. We don't need to be afraid of this kind of data. Where does that leave us? Ultimately, materialism seeks to segment. It seeks to explain the world and people through an extremely narrow lens that offers a very diminished view of what it means to be a human being and what it means to live in the world that we live in. Christianity, on the other hand, seeks to hold together complexity. It offers us holism. It says the world we live in is complex and people are complex, and therefore we need a framework that can hold that complexity together. And we see that right from the very first verses of the Bible. Reality is both physical and spiritual. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. God creates not just an earth, but also heavens. And there isn't just the physical waters, but also the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. The physical world and the spiritual world exist together. And in the creation of human beings, we see that humans are both dust and breath. Neshama or ruach, the Hebrew for spirit or breath. We are dust and we are breath. We are physical, we are integrated physical and spiritual beings. And therefore, brain activity is exactly what we should expect. We don't need to be afraid of this data. It's simply reflecting that we are integrated beings. In fact, we would be more concerned if there's nothing going on in your brain when you're praying. Now, very briefly, what does it mean in practice to be a Christian in a scientific world? It means that we engage with the scientific world. We don't retreat from it. And this might look differently for different people. For some of us, it means being part of the scientific community. Some of us already have a calling to be in the world of sciences, to be a really brilliant scientist, to actually publish and gain a reputation in your field. And that is actually something that God has given you. And there are parts of the natural world He has given you to discover and to uncover. And your calling is to lead by example and to be brilliant and gracious and fair and a good PhD supervisor. I had a terrible one. Be a good one. And of course, you need support and encouragement in that. There are people here who are perhaps at a crossroads and are figuring out what to do. There are people here who are called into the sciences. God is the creator of the mind. He's given you a mind to use. And men and women are called into this. Others of us, it might be our role to keep batting down the zombies. Actually, part of our role is to keep speaking into the debate. And there are people here, both men and women, who God is calling to speak into this conversation. The work is not finished yet. The landscape is shifting, but we still need people to chip away at the wall and to bat down the zombies. And of course, we are all to continue to have courageous conversations with friends, with family, with colleagues, with neighbors, to show that placing your trust in Jesus Christ is not an unthinking thing to do. In fact, it is the most rational decision you could ever make in this world. And this is actually vital to my own journey. After that moment of hearing the answer to that question and grilling lots more Christians and asking lots more questions, about halfway through my degree in biochemistry, I realized not that I had all my questions answered, but enough of them answered to know that the person of Jesus Christ made sense. It made sense of my heart, made sense of the world, made sense of why science was even possible at all. And it was extraordinary to continue in the sciences, not only studying the natural world, but also knowing the God who made it all. And the truth is that the tide has turned one person at a time. Imagine the impact that every person in this room could have on this conversation. We each have a part to play. in bringing it in.